Now to Dr. Jasek for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to all our witnesses for your testimony. As you know, what we are trying to do on this committee is to study how best to integrate Indigenous traditional knowledge and science into government policy development. And I would really like to hear from you some practical suggestions as to how we might do this. Government policy can be initiated, as an example, through federal government agencies. So I'm thinking about research dollars, things like CIHR, NSERC, etc., etc. Could you what would you say about some of those government agencies being required to look for Indigenous collaboration or consultation in some fashion in granting those research dollars? I'm just trying to, I just throw that one out, but do you have any suggestions? Perhaps, Dr. Turner, we could start with you.
Thank you very much for that question, and I think it's a really important one. One of the points that I was planning to make in my talk was to note that there's often a major funding disparity between Western scientists and academics and their students and Indigenous knowledge keepers and those Indigenous youth and others who are interested in learning about their lands. Many elders in First Nations communities, even some of the most knowledgeable, live below the poverty line and need to rely on others to take them out on the land. They don't necessarily have the same level of equipment, travel grants, or salaries that are needed to get out. Therefore, I think addressing this deficit for Indigenous peoples and communities should be a major priority, and that can be accomplished through the federal granting agencies, as you've mentioned, or through other means, but making sure that Indigenous knowledge keepers have the same financial backing that Western academic scientists have. I think that would be really important. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. And actually, to get back to what Mr. Lobb was asking, perhaps Dr. Kelly, could you give us some examples from your experience as to how weaving Indigenous knowledge into issues and problems that you've seen through your career has assisted in some areas other than perhaps the environmental issues, going beyond into health, homelessness, drug use, whatever comes to mind. Could you give us some examples where it's been very beneficial?
Yes, thank you very much for your question. What I was trying to allude to in what I was saying is that, for example, in the work with the research offices, or when I'm teaching my students, I teach in all these programs, whether it's health, environmental, or Indigenous education. What I'm encountering is young people who are coming from children who are discontent with the way, the worldview, I'd say, how we are attending to medicine, how we're attending to education, how we're attending to environmental issues. And what they're grateful for, what they tell me, is they're grateful to encounter Indigenous understandings. So they're grateful for the way, the worldview, another way of looking at the world, and how that implicates or it transforms the way they look at the field that they have chosen to work in, whether that's health or education or land use, whatever the issue is. And so they're grateful. They call it, one of my students said to me when I asked these questions I asked us, she said, you ask us what kind of ancestor do we want to be? How are we carrying on the legacy? She said, my 15-year-old son asked me the same question. So how do we help in creating this capacity so that we all have a greater understanding of those understandings in our daily life. And then they implicate how we act in relationship to that which we're working with. It happens in medicine. I worked in hospitals in Europe where they went from the span, this was also presented in one of your other witnesses, from homeopathic to allopathic. And that was all on the table when we were looking at the well-being and healing. Same in education. What's a holistic, inclusive way of understanding the world that then implicates education? The deficit model, respectfully, based on our scientific understandings, is causing great harm to children.
So, in other words, quality of life is just as important, perhaps, as physical longevity or some measures that we conventionally use, perhaps, if I could paraphrase what you're saying.
Well, I think the teachings of Indigenous people are relevant to all that we do today.
Great. Wow. It's great testimony. And thank you for the questions as well. It's wonderful to have the three of you here with us today. And